Buenas noches, good evening. How is everybody? I have the distinct and strange pleasure of speaking in a Spanish center to people interested in Catalan culture in English, but that's the way it goes in New York. Thank you for coming tonight. It's a distinct honor for me to introduce our new King Juan Carlos chair for the semester at New York University. As I introduce him, I'm going to be shamelessly plagiarizing and stealing the words, but see, I'm attributing, of Jordana Mendelsohn and Marianne Newman, who are responsible for nominating and bringing Josep to our university and to the center. Every year and every semester, the center brings a different visiting scholar, and for the last 2 years, we turned the direction of those visitors toward the subject of journalism, reporting, and public intellectual practices. And I'm so happy that it turned us toward someone with an extraordinary public engagement, civic engagement, and who's a real public intellectual. I'm happy to see that the founding director of the center, Jim Fernandez, just walked in. And so I'm going to do a little introduction of the man who speak tonight, and hope to do him a little justice, but certainly not complete. And again, thank you to Marianne and Jordana for the words that I'm about to steal. Josep Maria Muñoz is a public intellectual. He's a historian with a doctorate in history, on a historian, an editor of an extraordinary cultural magazine. By profession, he is also a publisher and a translator, and he worked with the city of Barcelona at the moment of its most spectacular global success, perhaps. He was born in Barcelona in 1959, and as a fairly young man, Muñoz was member of the cabinet of Mayor Pascual Maragall. He's laughing, but I think he's pretty young then. From 1987 to 1995 in Barcelona. He was present during that extreme auge, right, of Barcelona during the Olympic period, Mount Olympus notwithstanding, as a speechwriter, as a planner of events, international visits. So he is, in a sense, an architect of Barcelona, what Barcelona has become in the mind of anyone who loves that city or imagines it and who knows it for 20 years or more. He received his doctorate with distinction from the Universitat de Barcelona in 1995 in contemporary history. As a historian, and here I'm cribbing from Marianne Newman, Josep Maria is a contemporary expert on one of the great Catalan historians of the Civil War and post-Civil War period, Jaume Vicens i Vives. And he brought the Anal School of Historiography to Spain and established a tradition of rigor to the field. To do work on such a historian in Catalonia and Barcelona, I think, is an extraordinary and important recuperation. And of course, the dissertation and the projects that succeeded it were an enormous success and much lauded. Josep Maria has since published several books on the topic and curated 2 exhibitions and later an accompanying catalog, one of them on the relationship between Vives and Josep Villa, another great 20th century Catalan writer and journalist. Following his doctorate, and this should be aliento to any PhD, he served as Director of Cultural Services of the MACBA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, from 1995 to 1999. There, he was responsible for conceptualizing and programming many of the cultural activities that accompanied the exhibitions and running the center and the museum itself. Somewhere between 1999 and 2000, he recalls, but it seems to be a bit blurry, he became editor of La Venche. And as editor of La Venche, Muñoz has converted a storied historical review, as Marianne Newman put it, into a cultural and historical sounding board for issues of concern to Catalonia and the world. His work as editor is both conceptual and hands-on, and he addresses the issues facing print journalism and cultural journalism in Europe. He's also started a publishing imprint under that umbrella and translated essential works of European literature that attest to his intellectual breadth. Josep Maria Muñoz developed a particular expertise in the art of the long-form interview, and this intersects with our journalism emphasis. The list of his subjects, and I thank Marianne again, is long and Catholic, in the global sense. And they include Ian Buruma, John Eliot, Carlo Ginzburg, Colm Tóibín, Svetan Todorov, and Paul Friedman in Europe and America, and a gamut of figures from the Catalan and Spanish sphere that has given him an extraordinary window into contemporary thought and creativity. Few public intellectuals in Spain, as Marianne puts it, would have his ability to theorize the place of Spanish and Catalan culture and cultural figures in a broad international intellectual context, both historical and contemporary. My colleague, Jordana Mendelsohn, wrote to me as she nominated, or wrote to us as she nominated Josep. If we consider not only the productive and intellectual space of journalism, but also the essential function of the public intellectual who creates and intervenes in public space, public memory, civic policy, and public discussion, then Josep Maria Muñoz is an exemplar of an engaged intellectual. Jordana goes on, for those who haven't read L'Avenç or used it in their research, it might be hard to capture its cultural significance. L'Avenç has been the leading cultural periodical in Barcelona for decades, dedicating special issues to key events and figures in cultural, literary, and political history. It became a reference point for new scholarship on Catalonia. Recently, the translator Damien Searles, Jordana goes on, summed up the stature of L'Avenç by comparing it, with no intention of hyperbole, to the New York Review of Books. This scholar of Catalan history, Jordana wrote, has been an active participant in the contemporary history of the city of Barcelona himself. The boom of the city's growth during the period Muñoz worked in the mayor's office is well documented, but reconsidering the city's growth in light of Spain's current economic crisis, political upheaval, and the tensions between Catalonia and the central government all make his presence on campus at NYU an invigorating catalyst to discussions about the relevance of Spain's crisis and Catalonia's position in relation to the rest of the peninsula. Josep Maria Muñoz will be with us this semester, and as part of his duties, he will be teaching a multidisciplinary course through the history and the Spanish department on contemporary political culture. He will be organizing a symposium, which I hope you will all come to, on November 17th and 18th on the Catalan question and the Spanish crisis, and a closing conversation on Barcelona, which is still in development but involves some of the people in this room, I can tell you that. Tonight, the title of his lecture is A New Farewell to Spain, Catalonia, the Spanish Crisis, and the Echoes of 1898. We're delighted and honored to welcome Josep Maria Muñoz to the King Juan Carlos Center and to New York University.
Thank you, Anna, for this so nice and perhaps too generous introduction. As you know, I'm very honored and above all, very happy to be here in New York as becoming, during this semester, part of this vibrant intellectual community of NYU. This is a welcoming city. You only need to meet Jordana Mendelsohn to dispel any doubt about it. Jordana, many thanks for your help and for your enthusiasm. But if there is someone in the city I'm indebted, is my friend Marianne Newman, whom all of us in Barcelona consider, in all fairness, the informal ambassador of Catalonia, New York. I would like to think that my stay here is compensating, even in a very small extent, the absence of the Catalan Center of NYU, a place where Marianne did a so nice job during a too short period. The closure of the center was a regrettable error that will cost a lot to repair. I do also want to express my thankful recognition to the late John Brademas, who passed away this summer. As president of NYU, he was a crucial person in the creation of this center. Besides, I am almost sure that one of the first books I ever read about the Spanish Civil War was his book on the Catalan anarcho-syndicalism. A book that seemed to announce a great historian who, as it often happens, was engulfed soon by his political vocation. His book was translated in Spain in 1974, when I was 15, not so young. I found it in the well-stocked library of my grandfather, although while I was reading it, I had to bear the warnings of my grandmother saying young people should not read these things. I could personally greet Joan Maragall on my first visit to this city. I was then working for the mayor of Barcelona, Joan Maragall, as Anna was recalling now. Maragall gave a party for us in a stunning penthouse in Washington Square. I was really impressed. It was in 1988, and the Democratic presidential candidate was then Michael Dukakis. I can remember Maragall, in an informal address, saying that America should be placed in the hands of the children of the Greek immigrants like Dukakis and Maragall himself. In this my first public appearance, I can't help feeling like the character of this splendid novel by Nabokov, The Real Life of Sebastian Knight. As you probably remember, the narrator is trying to reconstruct a novelist's life and says, poor Knight, he really had two periods. The first, a dull man writing broken English. The second, a broken man writing dull English. Anna, at the end of the semester, I am confident to be a broken professor teaching in a dull English. So let's begin now in perhaps broken English, my lecture. In today's Spain, it's not surprising to find a Sunday newspaper opinion piece titled From 1998 Onwards. Needless to say, 98 refers to 1898, a critical date in the country's history. That was the year it lost its last colonies, Cuba and the Philippines, after also losing a brief war with the United States. The author of this article I am referring to is Catalan writer Carme Riera, a recently appointed member of the Royal Spanish Academy. She begins by expressing her pessimism about the present situation in Spain, which she compares with the crisis of '98. It was a crisis, she says, which bore demoralizing consequences for all those inhabitants of a country that the poet Manuel Machado considered poor and almost savage, and another poet, Jaime Gil de Viedma, regarded as old and inefficient. There are many examples in a similar tone. Once again, you seem to hear the famous rebuke by Gil de Viedma, writing in a gloomy mood at the end of 1961 or the beginning of 1962. De todas las historias de la historia, sin duda la más triste es la de España porque termina mal. Of all the histories of the history, the saddest is certainly Spain's because it ends badly. Shortly afterwards, in a letter to his friend Joan Ferrater, he penned this distressing portrait of Spain. It seems that Spain, Gil Viedma is the man on the far right, only when you see the photos, of course. It was a political statement. It seems that Spain, a feudal country which has not feudalism, which has not had feudalism, a bourgeois country which has never had a bourgeois revolution, is preparing to be a neo-capitalist country without big capitalism. We are moving towards a consumer economy, but with minimum consumption. Our future is to become the least developed of developed countries. that is, to acquire new miseries and new defects without losing any of the old. At the beginning of the 60s, the end of Franco's regime looked far off, and it was far off, which explains Hilde Wiedmer's glum tone. But having misgivings about the country's future belonged to a very old tradition indeed. When asked to summarize the history of Spain in a few words, Ramon Carande, one of the country's greatest historians, simply said, demasiados retrocesos, too many steps backwards. This pessimism about the historical pace of Spain, that was unable to set out on the path of modernity, was so compelling that it had turned into a sort of literary genre. But please note, I am using the past tense. After the miracle, others would prefer to call it the myth, of the transition to democracy, this despair was almost completely discarded and sometimes substituted by an equally unfounded triumphalism. Either way, it's undeniable that Spain has changed a lot, and for the better, in the last 40 years. It's now the fifth strongest economy of the European Union. It's a democratic country that has resolved the main social issues that prevented his modernization, and it has overcome its historical backwardness. In many ways, it's a country that has recovered its pride. There was even a time when the national soccer team was winning all championships. Before the fatal impact of the 2008 financial crisis, Prime Minister Aznar had proclaimed to the world, Spain is doing well. So, why are the echoes of 1898 still resounding? Why is Carmen Riera referring again to Manuel Machado's poor and almost savage country, and to Hilde Wiedmer's old and inefficient Spain? Why are we still hearing these old lamentations? The impact of the social and economic breakdown that has afflicted the whole country since the 2008 financial crisis is largely to blame. When the crisis savagely erupted, putting an end to any previous euphoria, the old ghosts returned. In 2007, before the onset of the crisis, a British correspondent for The Guardian, Giles Tremblett, published a book called Ghosts of Spain. His ghosts are those of the Civil War, the many wounds that never healed, and the murdered bodies that are still buried unidentified in so many of Spain's roadside ditches. In a press interview, Tremblett recognized that Spain is a country that has changed a lot, and for the better. But he also stressed that there is a clash about the meaning of the history of Spain, a fundamental disagreement, which is very Spanish, he says, about the past and even about the very nature of the country, or in other words, whether it is a nation or a group of nations. Another reporter, Tom Barnes-Marañón, a long-time correspondent in Madrid for the Financial Times, has recently written a book on the Spanish transition, De la fruta madura a la manzana podrida, from ripe fruit to the rotten apple, where he uses a horticultural metaphor in an attempt to summarize the path Spain has taken in the past 40 years. Democracy came as a ripe fruit after the economic development of the 60s, but thanks to corruption, it soon started turning into a rotten apple when power oscillated between the two dominant parties and created a clientele system with no effective mechanisms of control. In his opinion, the Spanish transition rightly opted for a kind of continuity, namely a formal break with the past under the guise of reform, which, while without affecting the hegemony of the dominant social group, did achieve the best constitutional structure in 200 years. Thanks to this, in the words of Julián Marías, whom he quotes, Spain was no longer un fenómeno de feria, a freak show, but a normal European country free of inferiority complexes. However, Burns concedes that both the party system and the territorial issue, particularly the insistence that all regions would be served the same in a coffee-for-all implementation of home rule, and failure to recognize Catalonia as a distinct reality, have led to the present institutional crisis. This evening, I would like to focus my lecture on Catalonia, and specifically on the existence for the first time in its modern history of a large, popular, democratic, inclusive movement for its independence, which, since 2010, has gained a previously unseen and unforeseen strength. Even if it's not always recognized in the public debate, this is a crucial element in the current Spanish crisis. But far from being a byproduct of it, destined to disappear when the crisis is over, the case of the Catalans has a more than a century-old history. As Carme Riera recalls, the so-called Catalan problem goes back to 1898. In fact, along with the Basque problem, this term began to appear in the Spanish press in the 1880s. Barely used today, it has been replaced by another disturbing expression, el desafío catalán, the Catalan challenge. We should keep this term in mind because words matter. It all starts with a map, this map. It's a map dated 1852, which means it was drawn up relatively soon after the liberal national state had replaced the old division of the country into kingdoms and principalities, with a strictly provincial system as stipulated in the 1833 plan. By then, the territorial organization of the new state was presented in form of this political map of Spain, which grouped the provinces in accordance with the special regime then in force. Hence, it distinguished the uniform and fully constitutional Spain, that is, the Crown of Castile and Leon, the Spain of the Fueros, the Basque Country and Navarre, with their own charters, the incorporated or assimilated Spain, which in fact is the old Crown of Aragon, and still then, the colonial Spain. The Untitled, and perhaps you said the Antilles, sorry, British English, the Antilles and the Philippines. The way leading to the nation state set forth in Spain's first National Sovereign Assembly, the Cádiz Cortes of 1812, had been paved a century earlier with the military victory of King Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain in the War of the Spanish Succession. The absolutist Bourbon regime, French in origin and inspiration, abolished constitutions and the institutions of the Crown of Aragon by means of the Nueva Planta, new pattern, decrees, thereby putting an end to the earlier composite structure of the Spanish monarchy. The history of 19th century Spain is, to some extent, the history of the construction of this nation state, and also of its partial failure, at least in Catalonia. The notion of the feeble 19th century Spanish nationalization, which we owe to the historian Borja de Riquer, is useful when it comes to understanding what prevented this nation-state from being wholly imposed as it had been in France, and why the old particularities, which were viewed by the liberals as redolent of the old regime, were not erased. In 1898, with the loss of its last colonies, the Spanish state had failed. Pessimism is set in among the Spanish regionalists who, seeing the state as dominated by an agrarian oligarchy, strove for the country's Europeanization. That year, in a famous poem, the Catalan poet and intellectual Joan Maragall said, "Adeu España, farewell to Spain." This was not, as a certain contemporary reading might seem to suggest, a call from Catalonia for independence, but rather a farewell to a certain conception of the state, that of imperial Spain, of the Castilian mold. In this Ode España, nicely translated into English by Marianne Newman, Maragall addresses the motherland as a son, but a son who speaks in a tongue that is not of Castile. A great change had come about. Catalonia, which, according to the historian Ferran Soldevila, had struggled for decades to be a province, was now reborn culturally and politically. Since then, the Catalan question has always been present in the history of Spain. At least one part of this incorporated Spain of the map resisted being assimilated into a unitary, monolingual state which was, moreover, unable to attend to its interests as a distinct, advanced industrial society. Catalonia was not province, and Barcelona was not Marseille. Then again, of course, Madrid was not Paris. The 20th century inaugurated the fixed rule. Any advance in the democratization of the inadequate Spanish state, which was so adverse to modernization, was inseparable for the need to find a solution to the Catalan question. Juxtaposing democratization of the state and autonomy for Catalonia had a counterbalance. Any anti-democratic regression in Spain automatically meant the abolition of Catalan autonomy. Hence, the Mancomunitat of Catalonia, the first regime of administrative decentralization achieved by the Catalans in 1914, 2 centuries after the abolition of their freedoms and institutions of 1714, the Mancomunitat was abolished barely 10 years later by the first military dictatorship, that of General Primo de Rivera. Proclaimed in 1931, the Second Spanish Republic was preceded by the Pact of San Sebastián, in which the Republican forces agreed to concede autonomy to Catalonia. However, the 1931 Constitution didn't establish the federal or confederal state which Catalonia had called for, but rather a so-called comprehensive state consistent with the autonomy of municipalities and regions. Vigorous opposition to this statute of Catalonia in the parliament, which was only overcome by the conviction of the Prime Minister Manuel Azaña that the Republic would come to grief if it was not approved, was a clear sign of misgivings about the Catalan question, even among progressive groups. In the end, the Republican Spring had no time to consolidate, since a military uprising in July 1936 among the justification for which the Catalan question was not exactly the least important, set off a long and bloody civil war which was won by the Nationals. In occupied Barcelona of 1939, a sign proclaimed, "Ha llegado España," Spain has come. The Franco regime, as you know, set about suppressing the Catalan problem as one of its first absolute priorities. It strove to annul the economic power of an industrial region as well as to eradicate the Catalan language and culture. Nonetheless, the regime's nationalization project in Catalonia failed to achieve what it was designed to do. Bereft of all legitimacy, and despite its staying power, which depended on the brutality of its repression, the Franco regime didn't succeed in assimilating Catalonia into Spain, at least not at the extent it aimed for. In 1976, Catalans once again turned out in large numbers to demonstrate, demanding freedom and autonomy. The French historian Pierre Vilar, a privileged participant observer, heard in the streets of Barcelona the cry, "Som una nació," we the Catalans are a nation. When Franco died in 1975, Catalonia, which had been in the forefront of the struggle against the regime, was singled out as a different reality and a key element of the new situation by the international press reporting on the Spanish transition. France's most influential newspaper at the time, the daily Le Monde, spoke in an editorial of the défi catalan, a challenge which, yet again, turned out to be inescapable. The equation in which Spanish democracy equaled Catalan autonomy was raised again. The Spanish Constitution of 1978, which some dubbed the Constitution of the Catalans because of the roles played in its drafting by the nationalist Miquel Roca-Junyent and the communist Jordi Solé-Tura, took on the challenge of defining what would later be known as the state of autonomies. For the first time in the history of Spanish constitutionalism, a state consisting of nationalities and regions with a right to autonomy was being discussed. As Pierre Vilar pointed out, however, the new state of autonomies was to be more artifice than edifice. Or, if you prefer, the Constitution left the edifice only half constructed, swathed in calculated ambiguity. The question of the state was absolutely central to the drafting of the Spanish Constitution of 1978, and it took up a considerable part of the parliamentary debates. At the time, the democratic forces wanted to scrap the strongly centralist state which had epitomized the dictatorship. But they were up against the still enormous power of those who wished to conserve its unitary nature. Not long ago, in a documentary broadcast by the French public television in February, the former King of Spain, Juan Carlos, recalled how, I am quoting, "A few days before he died, Franco took my hand and asked, 'Your Highness,' well, this kind of voice Franco had, 'Your Highness, the only thing I ask is that you preserve the unity of Spain.' And the king says, 'He didn't say do this or that. No, it was the unity of Spain. The rest,' and if you think about it, that means things." End of the quotation. It meant. Thanks to the transition, democratization of the institutions of the state was a fact But so is the state's continuity. There was no refounding of the Spanish state, and not even, in the symbolic sense, any catharsis of breaking with the Franco regime past. The Spanish transition was fruit of a certain correlation of forces. It's too easy to look back with hindsight, criticize its shortcomings, and point the finger at its most prominent figures. It went as far as it could. The upshot of this unequal correlation of forces was that the conditions set by the old regime supporters were forcefully imposed, obliging the democratic forces to tone down their programs of breaking with the past. Supervised by euphemistically named de facto powers, the drafting of the 1978 Constitution was especially scrutinized by the army when it came to dealing with the question of the state and the establishment of a system of regional autonomy. In any case, neither the Spanish Constitution nor the legal system adopted any mechanism designed to guarantee the national plurality of the state. Article 3 establishes the co-official nature of the other Spanish languages without mentioning what they are in the respective autonomous communities, but specifies that the state has one official language, Castilian. A Senate is established as the house of the territorial representation, but by contrast with Germany or other federal countries, it's not given any decision-making powers at the federal level. Plurinationality is not part of a state's symbology or of the image the state has or of itself and which it presents to the outside world. Naturally, this could not be more different from the plurilingualism of Belgium or Canada, for instance. One example will suffice. After the abdication of his father, the new king of Spain, Felipe VI, acceded to the throne on July 19, 2014, in a solemn ceremony before the Spanish Parliament, in what perhaps is, so far, the most important speech of his life. The king referred to Spain and the Spanish 43 times, to Spain's diversity 4 times, and to its plurality just once. He also mentioned, though vaguely, to the concerto of Spanish languages. Having made his speech entirely in Spanish, he ended by saying, "Thank you," in the 4 languages which are spoken in Spain. Muchas gracias, moltes gracias, eskerrik asko, moitas grazas. It must be recognized that as a contribution to the linguistic and cultural plurality of Spain, this was somewhat meager. However, if there are no mechanisms for recognizing and upholding plurality, and it must be noted, a political culture that would accept and encourage it, what is the point of the distinction between nationalities and regions established in the 1978 Constitution? The fact that the term nationalities is never used in Spanish legal and political language is quite significant in this regard. It's against this background that the process of reforming the statute, embarked upon by the Parliament of Catalonia in 2004, must be seen. The reform, seeking to safeguard the statutory powers against the process of lamination, this is the process of rolling, I think making thinner, to which they were being submitted by the state. The project was approved by 80% vote in the Parliament of Catalonia. Yet, a decision that was democratically approved and by constitutional mechanisms in a parliament representing a society in which the majority of members perceive themselves as belonging to a nation, was overturned by maneuvers coercing the constitutional bodies and by a court that had caved in to political dictates. A burgeoning disaffection with the Spanish state then appeared in Catalan society as a result of the inability of or unwillingness of the state to represent its majority interests. Although the debate on identity is sometimes mentioned, there has never been any discussion of the identity of the Catalans in all these years. What is at stake is a matter of political representation. A very considerable part of Catalan society discovered in 2010 that the Spanish state does not represent us. The mother of all battles, as it were, erupted in the summer of 2010 with the Constitutional Court's decision on the new Statute of Autonomy of Catalonia. The origins of this should be recalled. The Popular Party not only brought an action of unconstitutionality against a law that had impeccably observed all the democratic procedures, but it also ruthlessly contrived to obtain from that tribunal what it was unable to get from the elections. It's not surprising, then, that the jurist Pérez Royo should have stated that we are faced with a political operation resembling a coup d'etat. The close identification of the Spanish right with a nationalism that excludes diversity and plurality has a long history. Yet, with the left, the situation was not so different. The support of the socialist leader Zapatero for a plural Spain turned out to be feeble and reversible. Recent experience had shown the Catalan parties, both right and left, how difficult it is to find allies in their cause. In an interview in Lamentations, after more than 20 years in office, the Catalan nationalist Jordi Pujol was able to confirm that I quote, the attempt to ascertain whether the Spanish right was capable of finding a space for Catalonia was a failure. A similar conclusion was reached 3 years later, in 2007, this time with regard to the Spanish left, by his successor as President of the Generalitat, the socialist Joan Maragall, also in an interview published in Lamentations. All in all, the years between 2000 and 2010 turned out to be what the historian Joan Culla described as the decade of disappointments. With the Popular Party's sabotaging of the state's arbitral bodies, the Constitutional Court ceased to protect the majority decisions of the Catalans, in contrast with its earlier rulings, and imposed the wishes of a sector which, in Catalonia, represented only 15% of the vote. The Catalan response to the judicial coup was stunning. The marginal pro-independence movement now took center stage in the streets and in elections. The people were reacting to a system that did not represent them properly and that was loath to protect them in the exercise of their rights. At this point, it's worth remembering the editorial jointly published by all Catalan newspapers on November 2009, upholding the statute while awaiting decision of the Constitutional Court, was titled The Dignity of Catalonia. Not only self-government, but Catalonia's very dignity was at stake. And when it was finally pronounced, the ruling was particularly humiliating. The limits of the autonomous system with which Spain is endowed were perfectly clearly marked, and in order to overcome them, there was no alternative but demand Catalonia's statehood. Behind this political history lays another, less visible, but closely allied one, namely what we might call the redesigning of the socio-economic configuration of the Spanish state. An equal power between center and periphery has been a constant in the history of Spain, where, once again, for a very long time, the aim has been to make the whole country revolve around its capital, which is located, as you know, more or less in the geographic center of the Iberian Peninsula. For many years, though, Madrid was never more than the city of the court and the bureaucracy, while the dynamic economic centers were Barcelona and Bilbao. It was similar to the arrangement in Italy, with Rome on the one hand and Milan and Turin on the other. But Madrid, in a state fashioned along French lines, would not settle for being Rome. It wanted to be Paris. Reinforcing the capital has long been the great Spanish political project, both during the dictatorship and the years of democracy, because it is tenaciously believed that this means buttressing the unity of Spain. As the economist Germabel has solidly demonstrated, the design of the so-called radial system is by no means new, because since the 18th century it has gone hand in hand with the construction of a centralized state. But its radiating network of road infrastructure, when Madrid is the kilometer zero, has grown in recent decades with the twofold action of the public administration, the construction of high-velocity railway network as its most emblematic project, and also the extensions to Barajas Airport, and of large private corporations, with the result that Madrid has come to be the financial capital and headquarters of the big Spanish companies. With an eye on Latin America, which is deemed to be the Spanish economy's natural sector of expansion, Madrid has increasingly come to be the place where the country's major economic decisions are taken, with the subsequent conviction that there is no room in Spain for two metropolises. In 2001, the former mayor of Barcelona, the visionary Pasqual Maragall, was to capture the magnitude of the problem in an article titled Madrid se va, Madrid is leaving, where she challenged the radial plan of the Popular Party government and of its Ministry of Public Works. But for him, the main problem was that, I quote, Madrid is leaving Spain. It's playing in another league. We have the impression that Madrid is measuring itself against Miami, Buenos Aires, and Sao Paulo, that it's no longer interested in us. 2 years later, Maragall hammered home the idea. In a new article in El País, now titled Madrid Has Left, he says, the magnificent, I quote, the magnificent panorama painted by the Constitution of a plural Spain with languages, peoples, and nationalities united in a shared project has been fading in order to make way for the appearance of the real, unfading, and fireproof background picture, that of the radial willful and refractory Spain needing a firm hand in the center to manage its demands. Though now it could be a hand as economic as it is political, as liberal as it was once dictatorial, as obvious and innocent of every sin in a way it had never been before. End of the quotation. He's the grandson of the poet, you see. Of course, this is not just a Spanish phenomenon. Madrid is leaving Spain, and London is leaving Great Britain. This is precisely why a significant number of Scots wanted to leave the United Kingdom. The socio-economic model pushed by London is not theirs. Scotland's voters for yes wanted a model of a state and kind of society which are different from those imposed by the south of England, as the Thatcher years bitterly showed them. Oh, sorry, it's the wrong photo, the real estate. At this point, the importance of the question of financing the autonomous regions needs to be borne in mind. Although I won't go in that now, lucky you, it has been decisive in recent political developments. Until quite recently, political Catalanism accepted as its contribution to North-South solidarity the fiscal deficit arising from the difference in what Catalonia paid as taxes and what was received in the form of investments by and inputs of the state. Apart from some very early academic articles in the 1970s, this matter has not been a concern of politicians, business people, and academics until it was confirmed that the insufficient financing not only debilitated the locomotive of the Spanish train, which, historically speaking, is the Catalan economy, but it also prevented any attention being given to poverty and social needs in Catalonia, which are by no means less pressing than elsewhere. In the last decade, and as the result of a design explained by José María Aznar in a book he called España, la segunda transición, Spain, the second transition, published in 1994, the Popular Party government, I strongly recommend you the lecture of the Inquirer made by St. John Chilcot in the British Parliament about the responsibility of these guys in the Iraq war. In this book, the government, Aznar was making a design that the popular government has implemented, decided to renege of what it believed to be the excessive advances permitted by the Constitution with regard to autonomy, and has undertaken a rationalization of the state. However, this rationalization model, which punishes in fiscal and infrastructural terms some of Spain's most dynamic economies, has not been seriously questioned by anyone but the Catalans, perhaps because they are the ones who have most to lose. In a country, Spain, where nationalist pride has revived in recent years, the state is still not to be questioned, either from the right, because of pure patriotism, or from the left, because of deep-rooted Jacobinism based on arguments of solidarity between territories. Yet, the left has also strongly nationalist component. Pascual Maragall heard in a meeting of the Federal Committee of the Socialist Party the lament, Spain's disappearing like water running through our fingers. Tariq Ali, editor of the New Left Review, affirms that Scotland and Catalonia have given rise to the two most interesting movements today because in both of them, I'm quoting, I see a civic and not ethnic nationalism based on the fact that they don't feel represented. Scotland never voted for Thatcher, yet was hardest hit by her policies. Catalonia has never voted for Rajoy, but it's governed by him. In fact, end of the quote, in fact, Catalonia, which will until now had found a double mechanism of protection, namely voting for the conservative Catalan Nationalist Party, Convergència i Unió, in the autonomous elections, and for the Socialist Party in the general election, was still helpless before the Partido Popular's hegemony in Spain, with 11 million votes in the previous elections. I believe it would not be inaccurate to say that the whole pro-independence process we have seen since 2010 is a democratic revolt against the absence of representativeness in the Spanish political system. The revolt of the Catalans over these last years is not first and foremost a nationalist movement, but a democratic one. One could use Alice's term and call it civic nationalism. Neither it is only a reaction, although it did arise in response to certain circumstances, which is why I have emphasized the historical background in my speech. Fear of becoming economically and politically irrelevant is precisely what has placed so many Catalans in the dichotomy of being residual or independent, as Pujol put it. The capacity for mobilization of the Catalan national sovereignty movement, the existence of a unifying project that inspires hope, its transversality, its accumulation of political capital in the face of the Spanish state's stubborn refusal to start any kind of negotiation, have meant that in a very little time this independence movement has attained dimensions that were unimaginable not so long ago. In front of it, the popular government thought that they only had to wait it out, and the soufflé, as they call, would deflate. A feckless stance, which is probably in some sense related with the personality of Prime Minister Rajoy, but also and especially with the fact that the Popular Party has already managed to ensure that the Constitutional Court would decide in its favor. This is when Catalan nationalism excessively revealed its weaknesses. Problems of engaging in a larger-scale politics, naive willfulness, a simple view of history, and a worrying lack of political realism, which has led it to overlook the highly unequal power relationship in its confrontation with the nation-state, have frequently engendered blind confidence in its own forces, while at the same time underrating the power of the idea of and feeling for Spain within Catalonia itself. As Borja d'Arquer has stressed, I quote, instead of maintaining and expanding the unity of action, the independence leaders decided to abandon the more moderate social sectors and more uncertain political groups, and set about skipping stages, resorting to discourse that was both facile and innocent. The independence course was just, legitimate, and viable, and haste was neat because the enemy seemed quick. End of the quotation. At this point, it's worth recalling the prediction with overtones of a curse made by the former Spanish Prime Minister José María Aznar, a decisive figure in this story, as you know. He said that in order to stay united, Catalonia must stay Spanish, and also Catalonia will break up before Spain does. This prophecy was born from applying to the Catalan reality the mental framework of the Basque conflict, which is seen as a split with solid identity-based elements between nationalists and constitutionalists. The worst part of it all is that the Socialist Party shares this view. Otherwise, it would be impossible to understand why the still Secretary General of the PSOE, Pedro Sánchez, keeps alluding to the Catalan question as a problem of coexistence. In fact, the Socialist Party identifies with the policies of the popular government, egged on by the political barons in the different territories, urging them not to consent to any privilege for the Catalans, although it has made vague promises of a constitutional reform, but nobody knows how, why, with whom they will do it. Anyway, the question is on the table. Surveys show that 3/4 of the Catalans are in favor of a referendum on self-determination. A Spanish opinion, with very few exceptions, is that the Constitution does not permit this because sovereignty is founded on the Spanish people. This causes an authentic aporia, as the philosopher Josep put it. Catalan society cannot decide for itself because it's not recognized as a political subject, as a demos. Nonetheless, as Pérez Royo points out, even if this kind of referendum has no place in the Constitution, it is evident that the Catalans cannot be asked to have any volition other than the one they have. Or, as Luisa Elena Delgado notes in his recent book, La Nación Singular, The Singular Nation, Spain can't simply tell Catalans what the Vietnam War hoax told Americans who opposed the war: love it or leave it. This conflict between legality and legitimacy is the quagmire in which the question is presently bogged down, and it seems that there is no solution in sight. As I understand it, the Catalan question is more than anything else a Spanish question, to the extent that it reveals the historic difficulty of the Spanish state in accommodating to its constitutive plurality. The absence of any political response from the Spanish government, and, above all, the non-existence of any Spanish project that might be attractive for Catalonia, a fact which is lamented by many Catalans who are in favor of staying in Spain, cannot be blamed only on a particular kind of blindness. It has a great deal to do with the very nature of the Spanish nationalism that impregnates the whole political system. A Spanish nationalism seems to be a very long way from the constitutional patriotism advocate by German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, or the everyday plebiscite of which Ernst Renan spoke in his famous lecture of 1882. The naturalizing in the democratic era of a Spanish nationalism, which has shed the original sin of its identification with the Franco dictatorship, brings us back to the conception of the unity of Spain as, I quote, something pre-existing prior to and accordingly superior to the Constitution itself, which was denounced by a former president of the Constitutional Court, Pedro Cruz Villalón. In a debate on the Catalan question, Felipe González, one of Spain's most prominent politicians of the 20th century, claimed that, for him, if Catalonia separated from Spain, it would be like having an arm amputated. The organic view of the nation, of a nation that is no longer a person but a human body, takes us back to the idea of Spain as the Mater Dolorosa, which the historian Álvarez Junco has meticulously studied for the 19th century. The echoes of 1898 have not died away. In this framework of Spain as a human body, the philosopher Ortega y Gasset fallaciously stated that only Castilian heads had the appropriate organs for perceiving the great problem of Spain as a whole. In my opinion, the main problem is that these Castilian heads are simply unable to conceive of Catalonia, which they end up seeing as a foreign country, as Pablo Iglesias, the leader of Podemos, revealingly said not long ago when he was campaigning for the first time in Catalonia. The Spanish left has an obvious difficulty to understand the meaning and the scope of what happens in Catalonia. And if there is no understanding, if we don't find a language we can share, a terrain in which dialogue and agreement are possible, the solution to the problem will continue to be a long way off. Halfway through the 18th century, the American colonists rebelled against the English crown with the rallying cry of no taxation without representation. Strictly speaking, the Catalan democratic revolt is not a fiscal revolt, and perhaps the American one wasn't either. Although growing awareness of the importance of the decades-old burden of the fiscal deficit has been a weighty element in the argument that has been developing in the course of the Catalan independence. The greater part of Catalan society has essentially rebelled against a system that refuses to grant it proper political and symbolic representation, and which has been unable to find, for it has not looked for them, mechanisms ensuring the participation of minorities in the decisions of the majority. At the end of the day, these are the terms of the contract most people in Catalonia are seeking, a level of political representation that befits their fiscal responsibility. In any case, the present point in the Spanish politics is not propitious for seeking an intermediate solution. In negotiations over recent weeks, in an attempt to form a government, the Catalan question would seem to have been absent, but it's evident that it has been conditioned the possibility for agreement among the Spanish parties. Although some politicians went so far in the electoral campaigns to speak of a second transition, the chances of this today would seem to be more remote than ever. Moreover, if this hypothetical second transition isn't capable of tackling the question of Catalonia, which the first transition tried to do, although with considerable limitations, it would be not only be doomed to fail, but also unworthy of the name. The very possibility of a referendum in Catalonia, like those celebrated in Scotland or Quebec, is highly unlikely, although some jurists like Rubio Llorente, have opened the constitutional door. But the basic issue will remain as long as Spain is incapable of understanding and accepting that the equation between the democratization of a state and self-government in Catalonia is the question it must face today and yet again. The persistence of the majority political forces in Spain in clinging to nationalist rhetoric with the mantra of the unity of Spain will not help to solve the problem. Manuel Azaña, in a speech to Parliament in 1932, said that, I quote, "No political problem has its solution inscribed in the code of patriotism." And even if the pro-independence mobilization in Catalonia were to wane because the difficulties involved in keeping it constant over a long period, and even if the estelada, the starred flag of the cause, becomes faded and even tattered, sooner rather than later, Spain will end up discovering, to paraphrase the famous mini story by Augusto Monterroso, when he woke up, the Catalan question was still there. Thank you.
I think it's very curious in the parallels with Scotland that, and also thank you for the history, which I didn't know about, but it seems that Catalonia is trading, I guess the fiscal shackle, but monetary shackles, more than fiscal, from when it was on the peseta, now moving, then it wants to move to the euro, as Scotland does. They want their independence, but they're trading one set of shackles for another. Now to Brussels and Bundesbank and the ECB and the Troika, the whole thing, just like we saw in Greece and in a banking crisis in Italy right now. So not just that, but there's a lot of talk around Wall Street about the dissolution of the EU. Not a lot. I mean, they're not going to say that to their clients, but you can read it in Forbes magazine up here on Fifth Avenue, etc. So it's a very curious thing, and you didn't mention a new currency.
I did mention
a new currency, having your own monetary control. Or Catalan, Catalans having their own monetary control, or maybe being independent of the EU, so they don't go down with the ship.
It's always a problem with the meaning of the words. What does independence mean today in the context of European Union? An indebted country is no more independent. When a country is a part of the European Union, is no more independent. So I think one of the most difficult things to understand about the present situation in Catalonia is that many people has in mind the scheme of the nation state, which is not longer valid, which is not useful to understand. One of the things that Tariq Ali and myself are stressing on the Scottish and the Catalan movements is the new state we would like to have is not a copy of the state, of the existing state. It's a new kind of state, of course, and it's in Catalonia, as in Scotland, there is a long, a strong will to be part of Europe, to get within Europe, previous to the existence of the European Union. So independence, what does it mean? It does not mean the same thing that it did in the past century.
They're not choosing a Norwegian model with their own currency.
Mm-hmm.
And Norway trades with Europe. There's a small tariff.
Yeah.
I mean, there's other problems, but
Yeah. The euro problem is another story. This has just been published, a book by Josep Stiglitz, which I strongly recommend about this question.
Talking about Europe, Europe is a unity of nations, right? So
Of states, I should say.
so nation states, yes, whatever it's now ruling, right? So that means that Scotland, so the European politician says that if Scotland is voting out, they will be out of Europe, right? So this is clear at least. Regarding your conference, you said that Catalan is a national civic nationalism and not an ethnic nationalism, right? To me, it seems that it's quite an ethnic linguistic nationalism, and in most of your conference, you were pointing the importance of the Catalan language, right? And just because maybe not all the audience knows that, the common language in Catalonia is Spanish, right? It's not me who is saying this, it's Bernd Sadell, who is one of the best known sociolinguistics, right? So, and talking also about your the symbolic representation, the importance of the symbolic representation. So maybe also Catalonia can do efforts in the symbolic representation of the Spanish language in our community, right? So you said that the representations of the representatives of Spain were not using enough the Catalan language. But for example, the Catalan speakers maybe in Spain it's 10%, right? But how much they are using the Catalan representatives Spanish if it's the language of the majority of the city of the population of Catalonia, right? Well, this will be my remarks. Thank you.
Well, it's a matter of model. My model is a federal confederal country where the languages of the spoken in that state are official at the level of the state, as it happens in Canada. There are other models possibly.
The Catalonia that's seeking independence at the moment doesn't correspond to the Catalonia of previous iterations. So you had the map from 1852, the what was it, España Incorporada. Is that an issue? I mean, in the current debates, that how does the current administrative regions, what the 4 or 5 provinces, correspond with the historical Catalonia and then the historical concerns about nationality, about independence, about integration?
So sorry, which is the question?
So the question is that because the current Catalonia that is seeking independence doesn't correspond with more historical notions of Catalonia that includes the Islas Baleares, part of Aragon, all the way down to Alicante. How is that a factor, or how is that debated in the current context?
Yeah. Perhaps some strong partisans of independence would answer this question, saying that the Balearic Islands and Valencia will follow because they are discovering the same problems regarding financial deficit, etc. I don't think so. I have quoted Pierre Vilar, which was my master, and Pierre Vilar. One of the things we learned from him is that this notion of the uneven development, economic development, which explained the situation of Catalonia in regards to Spain. So the uneven development is in in the old crown of Aragon, and it explains in the last term why not Valencia or the Balearic Islands are in the same level of nationalism that Catalonia has.
Professor, thank you so much for being here tonight. Really great to see you. I really appreciated that you said earlier that words matter, the words that we choose to describe these things. And I was very surprised when we were looking at the picture of the manifestation on the 11th of September in 2012 that you described it as a democratic movement. Mm-hmm. Bear with me. It seems to me like the motivating factors behind the manifestation are in fact quite Republican. I mean, if Alexander de Tocqueville were alive today, if he looked at the model of the Constitution that exists in the country to the south of his own home country, he would just be ashamed. Separation of powers is almost non-existent. The line between church and state is somewhat tenuous, at the least. Given the past couple of years and some of the legislation that's passed, basic defense of certain civil rights also seems to be in question. The form of government, a republic, not a monarchy. I was wondering then if you might be able to speak to how those two words might compare in your opinions and in your experiences with the movement, a democratic movement versus a republican movement, mm-hmm. and the values that would define that distinction.
Mm-hmm. Oof, it's not an easy question for me, because of No, I was avoiding to use the word nationalism because it has connotations that it's too easy. You are nationalist, so you are willing state, and it's the natural consequence. No, and I was trying to explain that the movement has in Catalonia has changed because of the real understanding of the democratic deficits of the state. I don't know if it must be called a Republican program or not, but the main thing is the democratic deficit of this state, which was born with the transition, with the democratic transition, and the kind of things I have tried to explain. Sorry, I cannot be more.
Thank you for such a clear historic vision. It's very rare. I'm wondering if you could just make some reference to, I think, Matt would say, okay, let's call it a republic, and I am wondering if the civic, to what extent, what is the role that culture plays in the civic democracy that you're talking about? Because I think, I don't know, it's not exactly the same in Catalonia as in Scotland, perhaps. But.
Mm-hmm. Well, the kind of identity which exists in Scotland, it probably has to do with working class tradition, with another kind, and the way they see the world of London, etc. In the Catalan case, I guess that the questions of language, of culture, of course, are important, but I wouldn't say that they are the most important now. And they are the key elements in this kind of movement. And as you said, Catalan is not even the majority language in Catalonia nowadays. So it's not a matter of struggling for a language or for a culture. It's the struggle is for a democratic framework, different from that we have. So I think that the culture, as always happens in.
Maybe something more specific, though. I think I'm reading now a book by Josep What We Have Eaten, and. It's from 1971, and he's talking about food, basically, and it really calls my attention. Of course, there wasn't this independence movement in the 70s, or in the 50s, or in the 40s, but what there is a kind of cultural independence. He just you know, all he's talking about. There's a micro culture that he's referring to, and that is clearly the perimeter of his work. And I'm just wondering, you know, to what extent that doesn't that contribute mightily to the independence?
Of course, the fact that Catalonia sees itself as a distinct society. I think it's a thing that perhaps it's difficult to understand from people coming from abroad. That we consider ourselves as a distinct society of a nation, in fact, and it's part of the assumptions of this society.
I actually have a question for you.
Oh,
There's a couple people
I'm scared.
who might be sharing this.
You are scaring me.
So 1898, the triangle and the star,
Mhm.
reminds us of what else was lost in the Mate Dolorosa. So I want to take you back to that moment.
Mhm.
So when you think about the models that those others, the runaways, right, the insurgents
Mhm.
ended up with,
Mhm.
Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, the Philippines. There are various models, right, of states, success, disaster, colonialism, independence, more insurgency. So is the moment of 1898, right, and how does Barcelona relate to that beyond the figure of a flag, right? Which to many of us in the Caribbean, most Caribbeans probably don't know that we share the design of the flag, right?
Mhm.
The Puerto Rican flag and the Cuban flag, right? So is it about the Spanish, a kind of imaginary, a national imaginary of a kind of forced compensation? Could I ask you just to riff on that, right? On that relationship and the ongoing relationship between that. Is it traumatic? I'm not a big fan of trauma theory, but certainly the recalcitrance and the resurrection of kind of centralism of models of strong states, or the critique of a failed world system, right, brings up those echoes, right, of the ruptures of empire. So I wonder how you think of that, the other interlocutors in Barcelona who were severed, right, who sought to sever themselves from Spain.
Well, along this more than a century-old history of Catalanism, and I think there is a constant that is to look outside in search of allies, in search of models, in search of countries that had experienced similar situations, and it has been really constant with Ireland when the Republic of Ireland was born, with obviously with Cuba when you get his independence, and the really very few people who were then independentists choose as a model and incorporated this star in the. I must say also that this is not part of my imaginary. I don't really like very much this star on the flag, and you couldn't see in Barcelona 15 years ago. You scarcely look and could see this, and now the Chinese shops are selling it. It has changed.
So you're not a big. So this is a new form of like reviving that instant as well, right? The iconography.
Yes, I would say.
And most people here probably may not know, right, that at least in Cuba and in the Caribbean, it was Catalan anarchists, right, who helped to fuel all kinds of independent projects, political projects, in the 19th century. So anyway, that's my interest.
Perhaps we could follow the conversation
Yes.
outside.
So any other questions, or can we complete our conversation over wine and some Iberian cheeses.
Thank you.